Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Next week in this same room, we'll hear from Tom Slezak from Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, where he's been working on classified projects. I do not know if he's going to disclose any of those projects to us, but it would be very interesting to see what he is doing. And then the last Thursday of the Colloquium series is Ms. Tretakova, who is chief of Wikimedia. And today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Alex Freedland, Chief Executive Officer of Mirantis, who is going to explain to us the mysteries of OpenStack. So let's welcome our speaker.
George. Pleasure to be here. Sonoma State has a kind of special place in my heart because I had to get up at 6 a.m. this morning to avoid traffic, and I did successfully so. But the beauty of this, I had the pleasure to have breakfast with my daughter, who is a senior here. So this is great to be here, and thank you for this, institution for this. So today I'm going to talk about OpenStack, and clearly, of those of you who know what OpenStack is, who followed Mirantis, you realize that this is a lot of what I do. But rather than kind of have a opinionated story, I want to have some interactive discussion to make sure I can calibrate it to the audience and tell something that will interest all of you. So before I start, let me ask you a question. First of all, how many of you know what OpenStack is? One and a half. Okay. Okay, so rather than delving into the weeds, we should talk about what OpenStack is, why is it interesting, to be here, and did you come here because it's an interesting subject or because George suggested that you should come? So, how many of you heard of cloud computing? Everybody, okay. Will somebody venture to define what cloud computing means?
Saving your information on a server that's connected to the internet.
Saving your information on a server that's connected to the internet. Well, that's a common definition of cloud computing, but I don't believe that cloud computing is quite that, because we've been able to save data on remote disks in the days of mainframes, right? And nothing's changed. So. But yet everybody is yelling about cloud computing for some reason, and that couldn't be it.
Is it a more or less virtual storage space?
Virtual storage space. There's a component of that, but again, that's nothing new. Virtual storage spaces were done before. The 360s, 370s did it, right, in the TSO model. So,
utilizing computing resources that to the end user seem abstract, but are really implemented.
That's much closer. Creating a level of abstraction over computer resources in the infrastructure space. So compute, storage, and network being abstracted out so that people could use it without understanding how they're implemented. Again, virtualization is not quite the same as cloud computing, but we're getting closer. Any other takers? The important part of cloud computing, there are two other things that need to be mentioned. One is elasticity, which means that as you need more or less resources, they will be provided to you elastically without you having to necessarily know about it. And the other one is automation. In other words, you don't have to know how those things are provisioned. Infrastructure provisioning is completely automated. So if you're an application that's working on top of it, not only you have virtual resources, because VMware, I see the t-shirt here, VMware has been the pioneer of virtualization in this new derivative of our cloud computing world, but it's the elasticity and automation that is creating the cloud computing thing on top of virtualization. Right, so cloud computing essentially allows applications to know nothing about the infrastructure that they work on, whether it's application infrastructure or physical infrastructure, compute, storage, and network. And the reason this is important is because there is another component about cloud computing that's making it so important in the world of computing today. Cloud computing also is a different paradigm of how we consume computing infrastructures. And if cloud computing is done properly, it will create an economic equation with which the converse of the Moore's law, right? If you have the Moore's law that says, you have exponential growth of your data and all that, the cost also has to be going down exponentially. Without that, you're not going to be able to grow, right? So if you have a exponential growth of demand and your cost of supply is not destructing exponentially, you're going to reach a problem. So far, we as a computer industry have been able to address this through innovation, to keep the costs low. And we're seeing that a computer today, a personal computer today, costs the same or even maybe cheaper than it was 10 years ago, but the capacity is orders of magnitude larger. Well, to continue with this, as we're reaching the limits of the Moore's law at Intel chips, for example, we have to find other means. And cloud computing is, first of all, an economic paradigm of how we're going to consume those resources. And it allows us to create much larger utilization of physical resources, much better utilization. Example being, if you have all your resources virtualized and you have many different users, you can calculate a percentage of usage and make sure that all your resources are being used at 80% capacity, for example, right? Whereas all of you know that you have your personal computers sitting back in the office, they're not being used. So these computers are used maybe 1% of the time, so all this capacity is being wasted. So there's an economic equation that says if we do it correctly and create uniformity around it, then suddenly we can reach much stronger savings, and that's part of the value and cost destruction. There are more layers that we'll talk about, and let's now talk about OpenStack. So we're living in the middle of probably the largest transition of our generation. I mean, every 30 years we see major shifts in the computer industry. At first, we saw the big computers being built. They were as big as this room probably, right? And only very, very large companies could afford them, and they would lease them for machine time, and that's how IBMs and Data Generals and all those other guys were born. Then there was this whole transition into client-server, which is kind of the world that we know today. That client-server world started with IBM coming up with IBM PC, but most importantly, Microsoft coming up with an operating system, and then Apple did the same thing. And it created disintermediation between hardware and software. And Microsoft operating system became ubiquitous. It created the ecosystem of applications that people have been using. And that's the world we've been living today, both on the client side and on the server side. So now, what happened was the barrier to entry, the cost of entry for computing resources got disrupted by an order of magnitude immediately. And as a result, the industry grew that is probably 2-3 orders of magnitude larger than the old big box industry. So now that we're going into the next transition, cloud computing is taking over. That in turn pushes the cost of ownership of computing resources by an order of magnitude down, and the laws of economics suggest that we should have an industry which will be 2-3 orders of magnitude larger than the world that we know today. And we hear all those buzzwords like big data and all that. And so the reason this is important is because we have now a lot of data. The Internet of Things will continue to drive data into into our realm. All of the world's data is being collected by the Wikipedias, by Googles, by whatever. Technologies are being built to process this data. So you need to make sure that your computing resources are there who can process it. And as the data growing exponentially, the cost needs to also be going down exponentially. Then we have a sustainable technology world. So typically when you do that, there are some early innovators who create ways to drive this technology. And in our case, companies like Google and Facebook, they created their own operating systems, essentially, to run on top of those highly distributed commodity devices. And that's how they become so large and scalable. And we have seen that Google's and Facebook's have been able to deliver very complex IT that scales amongst billions of users at a price point that is unmatched in the industry. In fact, what's interesting is Mark Andreessen, who was the founder of Netscape and a famous venture capitalist today, he said something that I use a lot in my talks and in general in my thinking, that the Googles of this world have proved that you can deliver technology at a price point that is completely different. And if Google had no choice, because if they would go to Oracle and Sun to buy technologies at the price point that this is being provided, the bill to those vendors would be larger than the revenue that Google is able to derive. There wouldn't be a Google. There wouldn't be a Facebook. So those guys had to innovate. They innovated. And they did a couple of things. They showed it as possible, and then the commercial vendors came in, and Amazon, EC2 came in and kind of built the same thing, and is now offering it to the world, and probably at least half, if not more, of the market cap of Amazon, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, is attributed to their EC2, their elastic compute business. So they've built a proprietary kind of Apple of cloud computing, where they took the infrastructure, put a very nice cloud operating system on top of it, put all the application orchestrations level, and here we have a proprietary, very successful cloud that is now getting mass adoption to the order of several $1 billion a year already and continues to grow very fast. Now, Google is doing the same thing in a proprietary fashion, and Microsoft is trying to attack it from the Azure standpoint. But you remember what I said about the economy. It's very important for this thing to have, well, first of all, if you're just a user, not everybody can build its own brain, because an operating system for a cloud is like a brain. And brain building and brain surgery is an intricate matter. So you can have people like Google do it successfully, and Facebook's, but if you are a retailer like Walmart, or if you are a financial services company that is used to consuming technology from vendors, it's very, very hard for you to build your own brain every time. So you need a standard, and you need a standard that is not dependent on a vendor. Why is this important? Because computing is a hugely important resource, especially in the world where data is exploding, right? So imagine you give all your data and all your computing to an Amazon. And certainly you could technically. I mean, there are all those issues with security and all that. We've talked about the Snowden effect. So even putting that aside, if you give all the resources that are important for your enterprise to Amazon, then the pricing power you're going to have over the cost and the quality of this resource is going to be similar to us as consumers having leverage on PG&E. How much each of you have leverage on how much your PG&E bill is every year. There's some PUC there that kind of takes care of you, but in reality, they tell you how much it's going to be, and there's nothing you can do. So if you have vendors controlling such an important resource and there is no alternative, guess what's going to happen? The price destruction is not going to happen. Those people will have a monopoly or oligopoly, whatever. They will put the price to whatever it's going to be. The demand will grow exponentially. Those guys will continue to extract amazing, margins out of this, and we as an industry will come to a stop. So what's happening is there have been a way to kind of address this before, and we've seen open source kind of being used before as a way to address potential monopolies. And the best example that we know is that of Linux, right? And Linux is attributed to, for example, destroying Sun, right? So that has successfully happened. MySQL didn't quite destroy Oracle. In fact, now belongs to Oracle, but it certainly created a viable alternative and made it very, very difficult for Oracle to charge exorbitant prices, and that's why they ended up buying it, really. Likewise, you're seeing a barrage of open source browsers that are challenging the monopoly of Microsoft in the browser space, and so on and so forth. So traditionally, open source has always been a cheaper and more open alternative to an incumbent, and maybe didn't produce the same functionality that the vendor would have, but it would create an alternative that will put a pricing pressure on the incumbent. And that drove adoption. That's your open source of before, that's what drove it. we're seeing now things change a bit. And we're seeing things change a bit in the sense that open source suddenly is becoming a beacon of innovation, which hasn't happened before. And it's interesting because I was talking about Facebooks and Googles and all that. And these guys built their own indigenous technologies, and then suddenly what they did, they took those technologies and put them out there for everybody to use. And those are very, very innovative technology. Who knows what Hadoop is? A couple of people. So Hadoop is a way to process unstructured data, again, on a large distributed commodity resource base. So you can have a lot of computers, like Dell boxes or Quanta boxes, and you can have 1,000 of them or 10,000 of them as a cluster, and you can put your data from your Facebook and process it in parallel way and get the data that you want, which is very different from how oracles work, because they need to create a data structure first and then they can extract data. Hadoop, you don't need data structures. You have unstructured data, and then by way that you process, you can get smart data, and tomorrow you'll decide to get different data. You don't have to restructure your schema. So that's the difference. And Hadoop came from Google and Yahoo, and they went out. And MongoDB is again, also it's called NoSQL database, so it allows you to process your unstructured data. OpenStack is the cloud operating system, and that's what we're going to be focusing for the remaining 25 minutes. So suddenly, these are innovative solutions that didn't exist before, and they're coming out in open source. Why? Quick excursus into why. Why do you think people like Google would just give you this technology for free? They could have marketed it, probably made $1 billion on it, and yet they just kind of throw it out for everybody to use. Why? Why would Google do that? Any ideas?
They want people to find its problems so that they can improve it for their own uses.
That's a long game, because if you do that, Google is a lot more proficient in finding those problems. So if you start, it can happen in 20 years, but Google may not be, long enough to benefit.
Destroy their competition.
How would they destroy their competition? By making it available for everybody.
Well, I mean, they wouldn't have this choice.
No, they would. In fact,
They have to buy it from Google.
No, they made it free.
That's what I'm saying, but that's the reason they made it free.
So that what? So
that other companies like Microsoft and whoever would
Microsoft
be
can
able
take
to
it.
control the industry.
Okay. There's a little bit of that, I think. I'm not suggesting my answer is the ideal one. There is some of that. And
Draw consumer attention back to what product they're trying to sell.
in some ways. So, think about it. What is Google's, how's Google making money? Advertising. But ultimately, what is Google doing? What is their revenue proportionate to? Traffic. How do you double Google's market? How do you double Google's revenue? What do you need to do? It's kind of simple. You double the amount of information out there. So if you double the amount of information, and Google is the default choice by which people access information, Google will make more money. So when you throw this out and you allow people to process more data, it just creates free real estate on which you can put your advertisement things. So that's why they're putting those innovative things, and that's why open source is becoming an innovation engine, which never happened before. So we're like witnessing history here. Now let's jump back to OpenStack because we're limited in time. So OpenStack is an operating system for the cloud. And why do you need an open operating system for the cloud? For all the reasons that I explained, that operating system is what drives the infrastructure, the computing resource. And if it belongs to a Microsoft or a Google or an Amazon, they will have a monopoly. So you need to have an alternative where you can take it, consume it, build an infrastructure, and then allow all the components of the infrastructure, to be consumed without somebody determining what components you're allowed to have and how much you will pay for them. You open it up for the innovation. And there's a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening in the infrastructure space, be it networking or open compute that's changing our computers, and open networking that is now allowing you to do software-defined networking work. So you no longer have to buy expensive Cisco routers as your only choice. And the same thing in storage, right? So suddenly you're opening it up, and whoever is the most innovative can just plug it into the stack, and boom, you got yourself a solution. So what is OpenStack? OpenStack is essentially, right now at least, but it's going to change, it's the cloud operating system that creates a level of abstraction, a layer of abstraction for compute, network, and storage, and eventually it will go into the application space as well, so that you can consume all those things in an elastic and automated fashion through a given operating system. So just like you would, if you buy Linux or Microsoft Windows, it gives you a box. Box gives you compute, storage, and network, and you consume it through Microsoft Windows or Apple iOS or whatever the operating system. This is the same way to consume those resources, but in the context of a cloud. Now, why is it so interesting? OpenStack has just turned 4 years old in July. And yet, it already has this is, by the way, this is 6 months old. So the numbers are considerably larger now. This number is over 300, and this is over 15,000, and it continues to grow. So there is 269 companies, as of less than 4 years, and 12,000 people already members of that. There's close to 2,000 individual contributors, programmers who are contributing code to this thing, and 20,000 plus patches, probably close to 30,000 now, that have been merged into the code base. There are millions upon millions of lines of code that was created completely free by all this huge community. Here's a footprint of where those people are, who are members, and it's over 1,000 cities and across, in all continents. And developers are living in 400 cities, and you can see that this again covering the world. So. Pretty much, it's obvious now for everybody that. So I explained why there is a need for one open source cloud operating system, and there was competition. And you might have heard names like Eucalyptus, and you've heard that HP just bought Eucalyptus recently. For those who followed, and there were people like Nimbula that was bought by Oracle, and they're out. Then there's CloudStack, which is an open source cloud operating system that's pushed by Citrix, and that's pretty much irrelevant these days. So it's kind of obvious that OpenStack has won this battle. So it's a runaway train. It's going to be everywhere. And it happened very, very quickly. And we've never seen. OpenStack Foundation is the foundation that governs OpenStack. I happen to be one of their directors. And in fact, I'm flying tomorrow. There are 2 yearly summits for OpenStack Foundation. One is in the US, one is abroad, so this one is in Paris. We expect close to 7,000 people show up to the summit. We started 4 years ago with like 200 people, right? So it's been exponential growth. So as far as kind of a default operating system for a cloud that will drive your storage appliance or network appliance or your public clouds or private clouds and all that, there are still proprietary vendors like VMware who would offer this for a while, and it takes time for the thing to grow and stabilize. But the size of the community and the product, in 4 years, we've achieved the same level of size of the community as Linux took 25 years to get to. So why? What is the issue? If you are an enterprise that has to consume infrastructure, here's the stuff you have to deal with. You have your compute, you have your storage vendors, you have network vendors. And the typical way you compute them is each of them will give you their APIs, and you write to those APIs, and you have this wonderful situation, and then you do the same thing for all. And then when you have to deal with this, when you have to buy something new and all this, it becomes quite a nightmare. Not only it's a nightmare, but also if I build my application to consume API 3 for NetApp, and I need to buy more storage, guess who I'm going to be buying storage from? I'm kind of stuck. It's called lock-in. And guess what? If you're NetApp, what you will do? You will give me first 2 appliances essentially for free because you're going to integrate them with my API, and then when you're stuck, the next 20 that you have to grow as you buy, they're list price plus, and the list price keeps growing. And if you don't believe me, just look at the financial statements of Cisco's and NetApp's and EMC's and all that, and see how much gross margin they're getting on top of their equipment. So they're selling their equipment at 60+% gross margin, which is quite insane if you're selling 20, 40, $50 billion worth of stuff. At 60% gross margin, guess who gets all the profits of that industry? That's where it's flowing. It's quite a bit of a frustration. Doesn't have to be that way. So how can OpenStack help? So OpenStack is providing a ubiquitous API, the interface, that encapsulates all those drivers. And it has the single set of APIs, one for compute, one for storage, one for network. And as more services are being consumed, they're being also encapsulated through a ubiquitous API. And then they build a community where all those guys have no choice but to write plugins so that they can support, because this is a huge channel for people to sell through. And if they're not there, their product's not going to be bought, so they have to support it. And guess what happens? I have a single set of APIs, so if I want to, consume storage, I consume it through Cinder. And then if you have a Cinder plugin, whether you NetApp, SolidFire, and Exenta, doesn't matter. Then the only thing I have to understand is your price and functionality. So long as your price and functionality and performance is best, I can plug and play. So whoever comes in, even if you're a completely unknown player, you can just come in, plug into this open source without ever asking permission, create 5 use cases, and you got yourself a storage company, which, by the way, just happened, for some of you who may or may not follow the space. There's a company called Ceph that spun out of a cloud provider called DreamHost, and they've built an open source, highly available storage appliance or storage solution, software storage solution. And within 18 months, it became the default standard on top of OpenStack. And before we knew it, Red Hat bought them for $200 million, which kind of pisses us off, pardon my French, because instead of being a community thing, now belongs to a vendor. But that's life, right? If somebody builds something good, somebody will pick it up, will create another opening. Any one of you can build, there's now a need for Ceph number 2. And you can create $200 million in value in 18 months if you just follow that route. The playbook was already there. And plenty of people, just if you say, you want to build another Ceph because Ceph is gone, plenty of people will look at you. And you don't need anybody's permission. Now, why are people looking at OpenStack in cloud in general? So this is from the survey. It says, number 1 driver is cost savings. Number 2 is operational efficiency. Number 3 is openness. Number 4 is flexibility of underlying components. And number 5 is ability to innovate and compete, right? And if you look at all of this, mostly, these 2 are generic cloud stuff, but this one, and this one is very specific to OpenStack. And again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but proprietary is people will give you a solution like this. So they'll give you a solution that will work. It will be pre-integrated. As we say, you can have any color that you want, so long as it's black, right? In open source, it's very different. It's all those components, and somebody has to put them together, but it gives you choice. And with today's economy, today's technology, ability to, if you've heard the word DevOps and agile development and all that, the technologies are there to actually take this and in real time, like CI/CD is another term, continuous integration, continuous deployment. That's what we're seeing. All those, Gmails and all that. They keep using that to just consistently update production quality software on daily or multiple releases every day. That technology allows consuming open source in this fashion a lot more easy, which wasn't possible 10 years ago. As a result, so here is really what it means. So how is a typical enterprise buyer buying storage? They do a bake-off. They get EMC, they get NetApp, they get Fujitsu, Hitachi, all those guys come in, and they do a bake-off, and they understand, for Citibank. And Citibank will say, okay, for the next 3 years, for this particular application, we're buying EMCs. Here's the price. This is for 3 years. And every quarter, we'll be buying $50 million worth. That's your spend. And you're stuck on their API, and there's nothing you can do. And those big vendors would spend millions of dollars, for free to kind of win this, and then they'll monetize it. They'll sell you $2 billion worth of your Citibank. When you have an open ecosystem, you don't need to do this anymore, because you just say, I'm supporting Cinder, and I'm doing my bake-offs every day, and here's my things. And so long as you support Cinder, and so long as you do your thing, I'm doing it every day. And tomorrow, now I'm buying EMC. Next quarter I'll buy SolidFire because it's cheaper, or Ceph. And suddenly, instead of committing that money, you will commit this money, and this is all the money you're going to save on storage alone. And and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, and multiple billions of dollars in the ecosystem, right? So that's why I was talking about the Moore's law and the value destruction. That's what I was talking about. So some key players on how people are making money on OpenStack, but really that's just the way people make money in open source in general, right? So many of you may be thinking about how do you apply this, and this is again a playbook of how to be useful there, how to monetize it. So these are ways to monetize open source, right? Because the software itself is free. You can provide services and training around open source, and traditionally in OpenStack in particular, these were the players who did it. Again, this is about a year old, so a lot has changed since. But we led with services, and we became the #1 services player in OpenStack very, very quickly. We kind of wrote the book on it. Now HP and IBM are kind of replicating us. Innovance was a company, French-Canadian company, that kind of started that. And within 18 months, they were gobbled up by Red Hat for $100 million. There are tools that allow you to do something on top of OpenStack. So you can have a good installation, good monitoring tools, and things of that nature. So you can augment this. You use open source thing as a train. You get in, and then you add things on top of it, and you monetize it. So Crowbar was something that our friends at Dell have built, and it's not anymore. Dell went private, and it couldn't really compete in this space, and that's a whole subject to a different talk of what happened to them. Then there are things like distros. Distro stands for distribution. And the reason you need a distro is because not everybody is very technical. The early adopters are typically very technical, and they can have their own engineers kind of play with the stuff, and you help them with professional services and training and all that. But if you're a Citibank, you're not used to consuming technology. You want to take a product, put it in production, and know that if there's something doesn't work, you call somebody and they're reliable and they give you an SLA. And they need that because they have important applications like your, I don't know, if you're a Wells Fargo user, you have your thing when you want to see your financial reports, and you want to make sure it just works. And you can't take technology risks because you're not a technology company. So with that, vendors are coming in and they're building hardened distributions where they take the code, they harden it, they test it, they integrate with everything, and then sell it to you typically as something that's free, but they'll give you support on that, and the support they'll charge money for. And that's how Red Hat became Red Hat, which is now a $10 billion market cap company. They won the Linux battle, and they became the 10,000-pound gorilla in Linux, and they provide support. So HP is huge in this business. Ubuntu, which is a company called Canonical, owns that. Mark Shuttleworth. Those of you who kind of know, this is the a player who has a distro. Red Hat, of course, is big, and Mirantis. There were some smaller players like whatever, but they're pretty much all gone now. But these guys kind of build an open distro which is really, really close to actual OpenStack. They're not putting a lot of proprietary components. So if you look at this field now, the three major players who are kind of battling it out are these. We're currently #1. HP is investing $1 billion in this, and Red Hat, of course, is #1 open source company in general, and that's a huge game for them. If they don't win, they'll die as Red Hat. to them, it's an existential problem. And again, subject to a whole different discussion as to why Red Hat must win and what happens if they don't. And it's an interesting story because we started as friends on the services side. Then we declared the distro. They tried to buy us. They didn't, so they bought our competitor. They're an investor in us. And if you read Wall Street Journal, there are all those stories about Red Hat is becoming a monopolistic oracle of open source. And Mirantis is kind of trying to liberate people. So it's great publicity for us, but it's interesting how Red Hat used to be this company that would liberate the world from Oracle and Microsoft. Suddenly now they're viewed as a monopolist and we're viewed as a liberator. And then when this article happened and somebody called them Oracle of open source, we immediately got a call from a chief architect from Oracle and said, we'd love to work with you. And so a week later, we're getting a press release that Oracle publishes about a partnership where they're supporting all of their applications on loads on top of our OpenStack. So Oracle is trying to be open, and Red Hat is trying to be Oracle. So it's a funny, funny dance. So there's a way to run managed, right? Managed means instead of just providing you a product or a technology, you actually take the very utility that people are using it for, and you kind of run it for them. So it's like you come to somebody's production plant, and you become the operators of it, and they just get the results of it. So many customers are looking at that. So MetaCloud was a company that kind of did this as a startup. Cisco bought them, so Cisco now in this place. It was a $200 million purchase about maybe less than a month ago. Company with $5 million in revenue, $200 million acquisition. HP is big in this, and they, through their EDS, they kind of come in, have account control, and they offer things, to big, especially telcos and stuff. So, we're also in this business. And then you can build a derivative product, which is a bad strategy these days. Before it used to work, where you take something that's open source, you much improve it, and you sell it. It works if your open source solution is dominated by one vendor, like. What is that document management system? Alfresco. Everyone heard of Alfresco. So Alfresco is #1 document management system. So what you do is you say, I'm Alfresco, I kind of own this. You can have my version for free, and that's how kind of adoption goes. But if you want stuff that really, really works, well, I've kind of hardened it, and it's kind of different. But you can buy it from me. So, and then people can do, other people can contribute and provide services around it, but there is like one vendor. And I mentioned Cloud Stack and the cloud operating system that's owned by Citrix. Well, the reason we didn't embrace it in the first place because we realized that it's really just Citrix's gimmick. They use open source to drain adoption, but it's really their own proprietary system. So it's not a very good way these days to monetize open source. And of course, Nebula was a very, very loud company that was funded by Andy Bechtolsheim and Kleiner Perkins. Andy Bechtolsheim, of course, was one of the co-founders of Sun and the famous guy who wrote the first $100,000 check to the Google boys and made a few $1 billion on that. So he invested in Nebula, which is an OpenStack appliance, a thing that runs OpenStack inside, which was a strange decision. And I questioned him. I said, Andy, why on earth would you decide to invest OpenStack as an appliance? And he said, I did, really? I didn't know. Somebody just used my name. So that's how big guys invest. They have somebody managing their money, and then their name is used for marketing. But it's a sad story because the guys who started Nebula were the original authors of OpenStack. Chris Kemp was an original author of OpenStack at NASA. OpenStack started by NASA contributing their compute engine and Rackspace contributing their object storage engine, and that's what gave birth to OpenStack. So some of those guys got funded, but unfortunately the VCs didn't figure out the business model well, and I think cloud scaling just got purchased, acqui-hired by EMC just recently. Acqui-hire means investors get their money back and guys get some retention so they don't quit. So it's a cheap way or expensive way to hire good people in the markets that has a lot of talent shortage. So that just happened last week. These guys are on their last breath, and these guys are not doing too well. So that's kind of how this works. So just to kind of credential ourselves a little bit, So we are the #1 pure play, and I can explain what pure play is if I have some time. We have 130 customers, so we're by far now in OpenStack, by far the largest. But we, it was easy in the first phase because we had to, fight with the small startups. And then, of course, now it's all about going against Cisco and HP and IBM and all those other guys. Whole different game. We're #3 contributor to OpenStack. Last I looked, we wrote 14% of OpenStack. And out of this, so this is substantial. The percentage will go down as the community will grow. We're about 600 people. We raised some money. So before we had 20 million, and 2 weeks ago I think we announced a $100 million Series B, which is the largest Series B round in the history of open source. So that was quite a blow up in the industry. I mean, we're kind of the talk of the town, so it's going to be fun to go to Paris. But that's kind of a little bit of a story, and kind of gives you the idea of what kind of customers adopt OpenStack. So you have service providers who use it as an operating system for their cloud. Telcos, it's a huge new thing because OpenStack, because it works on commodity hardware, and it allows you to automate service provisioning. It is a driver who was called NFV, and again, that could be a subject of another conversation. NFV stands for Network Function Virtualization, which means that you can consume network services of a telco by going to a software portal and say, I want these services, I want this bandwidth, I want it now for the next 2 days. And boom, it will be provisioned automatically, and that's what you're going to get, which is very different to how you're going to consume it from AT&T today. Because today they're buying a huge Ericsson box or a huge whatever else box, which costs a lot of money, and they have these 6 services, they have to provision it differently, and the cost of provisioning is going to be going down by an order of magnitude. And there's a revolution going in this. OpenStack is kind of driving that. Enterprises are starting to buy, people like this. Home Depot and John Deere and all those other customers. They're starting to kind of drive some of their web entities that drive their, like, HomeDepot.com and other things where they have to actually talk to their customers. And of course, the Web 2.0 companies, the Salesforces of the world, the PayPals, the Semantics, they need to drive a huge infrastructure that needs to be very efficient. Workdays of this world. These are the guys who also kind of use OpenStack to kind of transform all of their business for agile and fast infrastructures. Also, all of our customers. So I think that puts me at 45 minutes. And I don't know, we have a couple more minutes for questions? Okay, questions.
You're an individual director for OpenStack.
Yes.
How does your role differ from a platinum or gold director?
So the way governance works in the foundation is as follows. There are two bodies that govern. One is the board of directors that governs all the business sides, and then there's a technical committee that governs all the technical decisions, and there's a wall between them. So the business guys don't affect the technical, and vice versa. Platinum means there's 8 platinum members, they each pay, and they have a director. Gold means there's up to 24 people, and they select 8 directors, and then there are 8 directors who are just randomly selected. The idea here is to have representation from all the groups, so that whoever is paying money, and it costs $500,000 a year for a 3-year commitment to buy a platinum seat, and they're completely oversubscribed. So what we didn't want to do when we built this foundation, we didn't want those guys who are buying influence to have an unreasonable influence. So the only influence they can have is no more than a third. Same is true for the gold. There's 24 people that are paying a lot less money, but they still have commercial interests. And there will also have a third of interest, and of course they're fiduciaries to their membership, so they have 2 fiduciaries. One is for the goodness of the foundation itself, and we all have that. And then their second fiduciary is to whoever appointed them, so to their company. And the interests of platinum and interests of gold are not necessarily the same. And then individuals are people like you and I, who are, a lot of them are developers, a lot of them are influencers through different means, and we have a whole third agenda. And so the idea was that the agenda, all 3 agendas are equally represented at the board. So I, as an individual member, my agenda, my number one agenda is to make sure that the foundation is thriving, OpenStack is thriving and growing. After that, I want to make sure that we're aligned to where the customers are going. We're aligned on the way the governance is working. We're aligned on whether OpenStack will be just an IIS or will bring value up the stack and so on and so forth. And I don't really care what Mirantis thinks about it. Now, in my case, I happen to know about what Mirantis thinks, but there are other people who are just coders and they don't care about their company's agenda. They kind of look at it very differently. And so it's a large, it's a large board of 24 people, and we have to make sure that all interests are being watched.
Is your service attractive to small businesses?
Our service is probably not, because they are expensive, but our product is, and our product is free, and we now have, I think we're about to get 10,000 downloads of our stuff this year alone, and for an enterprise product, that's a lot, right? And the number is growing like this. So we keep finding out that a whole number of businesses just came up, including small businesses, downloaded Mirantis OpenStack, put it on their like 10 servers, and they're running it without even telling us, and that's great. And then some of them suddenly wake up and say, we want commercial support, and they call us and say, can we buy support? And we said, okay, do we need to install? No, it's been working for 6 months now. How much is it? Oh, $25,000 a year. Thank you. Done. That's the best way for us to sell, right? So there's value to small companies, but probably not in buying services from us.
Any questions?
How do changes get from you as a distribution provider and you're doing an SLA and you do some major bug fixes or something like
Sure.
that are needed? How do those? What's the
How does it get
how
back
does it
upstream?
get back into the OpenStack, and what's the temptation of you to say, well, this kind of differentiates us. We've got a better version now.
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question. Is our temptation to build a fork is zero. In fact, the closer we are to the upstream, the better it is for us, because if I'm building a fork, then I have to explain to our customers why our fork is better. And today, the way adoption is happening is people want OpenStack. I just happen to have the largest number of seats in the runaway train. It's much cheaper for me to have seats in the train than market to the world my differentiation. So God forbid, right? So if I could, I would just sell you community version. The problem is community version doesn't always work. So for me to be able to solve problems like you suggested, I need to do two things. One is I need to be really, really active in the community. And Mirantis is number 3, and if you look at all the other guys, IBM, HP, and all this, I think the cheapest company there is Rackspace, and they're like $6 billion in market cap. Others are anywhere from 10 to like 200. And amongst them, there is like little Mirantis here, and we're number 3. So why? Because we have to have presence and understanding of what's happening in the community and trust of our peers, so that when we want to do something, we will have a way to do it fast. And we have some projects that we completely lead as innovators, and some when we have just sufficient presence so that we need to fix a bug and what have you, we're insiders, we can do it really expeditiously. Then every time, but for SLA, we can't rely on this process. So we have to have our own mirror, which we do, because there we can do it very, very fast. But then the way we fix problems is whenever we fix it, we want to upstream it right away. And that means that the way we fix them, the way we approach new development that has to happen between releases, we are very much in line with the community. We understand the blueprints and where it's going, and we try to minimize the chances of having a customization that will stay custom for more than one cycle. It happens occasionally, but to us it's plague. We don't want that. And that's why we're investing very heavily in open source development.
Is there anything to stop a large company from buying you out? Is it in the bylaws or something?
No. I mean, our investors wouldn't allow it. And we could be bought. And that's the last question that I'll answer. So But there are many interesting dynamics in this industry. It's a huge industry, and if you paid attention, the company who led investment in Mirantis is Intel Capital, which is a venture capital arm of Intel. Now, what's interesting, Intel is a very interesting company. They always, first of all, they survive by building ecosystems, and they're really good about being very friendly with people who hate each other. So they work with HP and they work with Dell, and they're friends with both, and these guys hate. So that's why we took them, because we understand we have to work with enemies. Having said that, Intel also is the only thing that is not going to be commoditized in the next 10 years. So long as Intel chip will continue to progress, it's very difficult to create an equivalent. So what Intel wants is they want the stack above it, which is how they sell their stuff, to commoditize as quickly as possible. Then the percentage of the overall spend that people will have, they will get a much larger percentage. So the one thing that Intel is not interested in is to see us being bought by one of the vendors and jack off the price. So they did something very interesting in the case of Cloudera, which is the analytics Hadoop thing, which is the leader in that space. And when they felt that there was a real risk of Cloudera being bought by Oracle, they went in, put $1 billion in Cloudera, and put in bylaws that they can only go public, they couldn't be acquired. And the price was $1 billion, and the market cap was $4 billion, and that was the price they paid to make sure that the Hadoop space is not going to get eaten away by the vendors. So we are kind of the Cloudera of OpenStack. So chances are, if somebody will aggressively come up and we say, hey, we want to sell, because they're invested, they'll get information, and then they'll have 2 weeks to react. And chances are they won't let us buy overbidding whoever is buying. Or maybe not, right? So the market will determine their many different interests, and the governance of the company is also kept in such a way that we have freedom to do things, including freedom to be sold.
Thank you.
Thank you.